Hello, everybody. This is Philippa Benson, the managing editor of CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, CABI's open access multidisciplinary journal. Today, on behalf of CABI, I'll be presenting a webinar on understanding authorship. We'll be focused on understanding issues of authorship and the many different complications involved. Most all senior scientists have encountered issues of authorship related to disputes regarding who has done what on what research and who should be authors on which publications in which order multiple times across their careers. Mid-level researchers run into these kinds of problems frequently as well and understand how serious they can become. Junior researchers, those just starting their careers, can face the really difficult situations where they want to get credit for their work in an authorship list, but don't have the rank or authority to claim that authorship, even if they deserve it. One way or another, not understanding issues of authorship is a problem, and it's important that all researchers do get a handle on these issues and learn about and develop knowledge and skills about how to promote their role as authors and enforce valid attribution of work on scientific research as their careers develop. So authorship is certainly a complex topic, and it poses significant and important challenges for individual scientists as well as to collaborative groups. It's central to research integrity, for it is the named authors on a paper who are taking responsibility for the integrity of the research itself, as well as taking responsibility for specific aspects of the work. Authorship is used as a benchmark in career advancement and professional assessment for scientists in research institutions or organizations of any kind. But authorship is also handled very differently across disciplines. And it's also handled differently in different cultural contexts, both cultural in terms of both social contexts and academic contexts. In addition, authorship is handled very differently from journal to journal. Different journals adhere to different guidelines and have different specifications and requirements for their authors of papers submitted to them. And authors also have various roles and responsibilities. There is the first author, there's the corresponding author, there's the person who sits as the last author. There are the authors in between. Each author has a different set of expected roles and responsibilities. And again, these differ from discipline to discipline, from journal to journal, and from culture to culture, meaning both social cultures as well as academic cultures. So there is really no one size fits all to address issues of authorship. An important aspect of understanding authorship is also to take a step back and carefully consider all the different kinds of audiences that come into play and that care about authorship throughout the research and publication process. Researchers at the beginnings of their career may often start to think about issues of authorship when they start to write the scholarly article, and they think about their co-authors and their colleagues. But it's wise to think about authorship at a whole range of times and phases beyond that. It's important to think about authorship in terms of the institutions that you're in, because authorship often comes into play when a scientist is trying to get tenure or promotion or a new job. It's important to remember that publication lists and authorship plays very important roles in career advancements in institutions. People who fund research often have requirements for their grant recipients to play certain authorship roles. And funders also look at the publication or productivity record of a researcher when deciding on awarding grants or other kinds of funding. Technologies also are involved in authorship, particularly with issues like ORCID IDs or persistent identifiers that allow an individual author to keep tagged and associated with work that they've contributed to. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. And in addition to that, of course, when you're actually writing the article, you need to think about the roles of authors in terms of the editors you'll be working with, the reviewers who will assess your manuscript, and the publishers who will be publishing your work. You need to think about all these different audiences and their view of authorship through the entire publication process. And this also includes after you've published work and you're trying to distribute and disseminate and bring attention to the science that you've done. So again, you need to think about issues of authorship throughout the entire research cycle and process. So authorship is really and increasingly a basic bedrock tenet of research integrity. A number of different organizations have taken central roles in defining parameters and guidelines for authorship, and they've done so because authorship is central to research integrity. It is the authors of published research who take responsibility for the quality and the integrity of the work that they're publishing and the integrity of the process of conducting that research. So some of the organizations that have played these roles in defining guidelines for what is authorship and how does it relate to scientific integrity include the Council on Publication Ethics, or COPE, the Council of Science Editors, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and the World Association of Medical Editors. Now, even though these last two focus on medicine, in their titles, the guidelines that they've put out really apply to all different fields. So these editorial research organizations have put forward different guidelines. And again, this is not a comprehensive list. It's just a sampling of organizations that have worked to define parameters and guidelines for authorship. So it's important also to realize that there really is no one-size-fits-all. When you're submitting to a journal, the journal rules are what you need to pay attention to. There is no one-size-fits-all. And authorship has no one-size-fits-all. So when you are actually getting ready to submit a manuscript, you need to look at the particular journal you're submitting to and see what their expectations and guidelines are. You need to look at very specifically what those guidelines are because they differ from journal to journal, and you need to read the instructions to authors. As someone who's worked on many different journals, both narrow and specific journals in conservation and applied biodiversity science, and I've also worked on large multidisciplinary journals. I can tell you the one thing that editors and staff say is, please, why don't the authors read the instructions to authors? So I strongly encourage you, when preparing a manuscript and thinking about selecting a journal, please read the instructions to authors carefully. So I mentioned before different guidelines that have been developed by organizations, and different journals can adhere or say that they follow the basic guidelines put forward by these organizations. And they differ in how they sort of slice and dice what authorship is to them. So here's an example. For the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, and many top-ranking journals adhere to these guidelines, they say that each author on a paper is expected to have made substantial contributions to the conception or design of the work, or substantial contributions to the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data, or the creation of new software used for that work. And in addition to one of those three things, each author should have participated in the drafting of the manuscript or the revision of the manuscript. They should have approved of the final manuscript as it was submitted to the journal, and they have to agree to be personally accountable for their own contributions to that manuscript, and they have to agree to ensure that if any questions come up related to the accuracy or integrity of any part of the work, even parts they didn't participate in doing or developing, that they agree to ensure that the questions are investigated and resolved and documented in the literature if there needs to be a correction or a retraction or something of that kind. This is what the responsibilities of the authors are for the ICMJE. This is the way that they articulate it. Now, for the Council of Science Editors, they have a slightly different way of articulating it, and that authorship falls into categories. And there are other journals that say that they adhere as a baseline to these guidelines, that authorship is attributable to providing ideas for research, for designing the research, for having oversight and responsibility within an organization in which the research took place, so the supervision, for providing resources that funded the research, for either developing or designing or requiring materials that were used in the research, that someone can get authorship if they organized or collected or analyzed data or interpreted the results. Someone can get authorship if they did literature searches, which can be a critical function in developing a manuscript. If they wrote the article, if they reviewed the article and revised it, or if they contributed some other novel contributions. This is the way that the Council of Science Editors defines what warrants and being an author on a paper. It's quite different in the approach than the ICMJE approach. Now, for NIH, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, they describe authorship a bit more flexibly, giving their guidelines as falling along a spectrum in the areas of designing studies or interpreting results, playing a supervisory role, playing a part in administrative or technical support, playing a part in acquiring the data or analyzing the data, or playing a part in writing the manuscript or revising it or reading it or commenting it. And whether those things warrant being listed as an author, as you can see here, from green to pink, sort of falls along a spectrum. This is how the U.S. National Institutes of Health encourages people to make authorship decisions. Again, this is a very, very different approach. So a lot of questions can come up when you're considering authorship listings on a manuscript. So is authorship warranted when somebody contributes an idea? How important is the idea? Is it a little idea? Is it a big idea? Is it relevant to only part of a manuscript or the whole manuscript? And who makes that decision? If someone has collected data, is it a lot of data that person collected? Is it a little bit of data, but perhaps it's really critical data that someone was involved in gathering? What happens if someone substantially improved the comprehensibility of a manuscript? This is really important when there are non-native speakers of English involved, and someone comes and revises a manuscript to read it, to make it read more clearly. What happens if someone looks at a manuscript and points out some fatal flaws and suggests that the authors do something substantial to change or improve the science, but beyond that doesn't really do very much? Does that person warrant authorship? Now, serious authorship problems can also arise with issues of guest authorship, honorary or gift authorship, ghost authorship, anonymous authorship, when an author has died or become incapacitated in some way, or if there are large groups when many, many people have done different things. So guest authorship is based on the expectation that including someone with a particular name will improve the chances that a manuscript will be considered for publication or published. The guest makes no contributions to the study, and so the person really doesn't meet any of the criteria for authorship. They're just invited to slap their name on it to give the paper more credibility. And honorary or gift authorship is similar to the guest authorship, although the person invited to put their name on the manuscript has a very loose affiliation with the study and the research. Perhaps it could be someone who's the head of a department or the head of a school. So they have something loosely to do with the people who did the study, but it didn't really do anything substantial. Ghost authors who participate in research but are not named or disclosed in the author byline or acknowledgements are also problems. This is when people are employed, for example, in pharmaceutical or device companies, or medical writers, or people in marketing, or very, very junior staff who are appointed to participate in the writing and development of the manuscript, but then don't get named in the authorship list. So this is a problem as much as guest and honorary authorship, where names are put on that shouldn't be. Ghost authorship is when people contribute to a manuscript and really don't get the credit that they deserve for that participation, or that is warranted for their participation. This is, the flip side of this is anonymous authorship. It is increasingly important because of pressures for research to be open and transparent, and that all authors be accountable for the research. It's really not appropriate to publish scientific reports anonymously. This is less of a problem these days because editors just don't allow it, but sometimes authors want to be anonymous if they are publishing something that is perhaps controversial or might get them in some hot water of some kind. Authorship problems also arise when an author has died, or has become very sick, or has just gone off the radar screen. When I was an editor for a large international journal, we dealt with these kinds of problems numerous times when someone who had contributed quite a lot to a study had died. And there was a big question about whether or not they could be included on the authorship list, because all the other authors wanted them to be listed, but the person never actually saw the manuscript and never approved of the manuscript or the final analysis. So that's an authorship problem. Should that person be included in the authorship list or not? And finally, when there are very, very large groups of authors, it becomes really difficult to give attribution or give responsibility for who did what part. So these questions arise. Who should be included in a list of authors and who is excluded? What should the order of authorship be? Who should be the corresponding author? And I'll talk about that more in a minute, because the corresponding author is an extremely important role. Who should be in the acknowledgements? That's another important question that needs to be addressed before a manuscript is finally submitted to a journal for consideration. The important thing here is to note that this issue of authorship needs to start to be discussed at the beginning of a collaboration, at the beginning of a research project, not at the beginning of the writing of the manuscript, but at the beginning of the research project itself. This topic should be on the table, and it should be ongoing over time as roles and responsibilities in the research evolve. So, there are challenges in authorship. Authorship disputes can be very unpleasant and can damage professional relationships. I can tell you in my career, I have sat on the sidelines and watched a number of really ugly disintegrations of relationships between researchers who got into arguments about who did what and who should get the most credit for what, and how that should be reflected in the authorship list. So please be aware that these kinds of disputes can and do happen, and they can be very damaging. So they should be avoided at all costs. You should, I would suggest, start with an agreement about authorship as a baseline at the beginning of a collaboration, bearing in mind that the situations change as research evolves. People take on different roles and responsibilities. They may take on a more prominent role, or their involvement may lessen. So the sort of weight of responsibility may change over time. The research situation will change over time, but that issue of authorship should be continuously discussed, and people should approach it with a flexible attitude. But again, discuss authorship at the beginning of every collaboration, and then be willing to change it and adjust it as the research goes on. So there's also the complication that there are cultural and regional and disciplinary differences in attitudes and practices in authorship. In some situations, the person who does the most work goes first. They put in the most effort, so the common practice is to put them at the head of the line. In some institutions and labs, a senior author may say that the junior author should go first, because being a first author can really provide a bump in a person's career. That's a very generous attitude towards authorship. After a first author, some say that the names go in the order of the greatest contribution. Some authors decide that it goes in alphabetical order if everybody feels that they've contributed equally. It really depends on the group and on the journal that is being submitted to, and many other factors. In some disciplines, the head of a group or the director of the institute goes last. So the last author in an author list can actually be a very prominent player, or it can be a bit of an acknowledgement of the role of the institution in supporting the research. But there are also other differences. What about the person who has to approve the work? That can be much higher up in an organization. What about the person who actually provided the grant money? Should that person be given a role in authorship? And what about someone who kind of guided a project from the side? All of these come into play, and they differ from institution to institution, culture to culture, discipline to discipline. Again, lots of shades of gray and lots of variations. And the way to approach this is to make sure that as you start collaboration on a project, that you have a goal of publishing, that you keep this issue of authorship on the table in open discussion with your collaborators from the beginning of the project all the way through to submission. So someone's going to be the first author, someone's going to be the corresponding author, and then there are going to be co-authors. And there are advantages of being a co-author somewhere in the middle. You are acknowledged as contributing your brain power and your experience and your resources. You've shared in the workload and gained from the research process and the writing. And if there are big names on the paper, it's an advantage to you to have co-authored with them. And there are also disadvantages to not being in one of the more prominent roles of authorship. That can be that your name is a little bit invisible, as often only the first and corresponding, perhaps last author names are viewed in a citation list, and the big names overshadow the newer junior authors. And having a large co-author group can become complicated when you get into the writing and revising process. As I mentioned, there are the roles of the first author, and someone can be put into the first author position for a number of different reasons. But corresponding authors do now, in contemporary scientific publishing, have a set of pretty important and well-defined responsibilities. And so you should be aware of these, and they are seen as being perhaps the most important authors, particularly from the point of view of people in editorial offices, because it's the corresponding author who plays the pivotal role in getting a manuscript from submission all the way through publication. So the corresponding author should be responsible for ensuring that all authors have received and approved of the manuscript that has been submitted. That is the responsibility of the corresponding author. Now, these days, some journals will accept dual corresponding author status. So there may be two corresponding authors rather than just one. Whether the journal has one or two and the manuscript has one or two, these are prominent and very important positions, because the authors have to ensure that everybody else in the group has approved of the submitted manuscript. They also have to make sure that everybody in the group is fully aware of and compliant with best practices, not just in doing the research, but also in publishing the research. So the corresponding authors are responsible for the ensuring that the action of and behaviors of everybody else in the group is aligned with best practices in research and in publishing. They're taking on that responsibility. They're responsible for ensuring that all authors have completed the conflict of interest declarations and the license to publish forms. Now, these license to publish forms are not Creative Commons or reuse licenses, but they're licenses that are giving the publisher the right to publish the manuscript. So, and most legitimate publishers ask authors, every single author of a paper, to complete these license to publish forms, as well as, of course, conflict of interest declarations. But it's the corresponding author's responsibility to make sure that these forms are complete and correct. The corresponding author is also responsible, of course, for the correspondence related to the processing of the manuscript. They have to take in and respond to all the substantive correspondence with the editors and the journal staff that are related to the manuscript issues and to the reviews. So the corresponding author, if a paper has been reviewed, has to get in those reviews, distribute them to all the other authors, get those authors' responses, compile them, and get them back to the editorial office with the revised manuscript. The corresponding authors are all authors too, are responsible for verifying that the data, the materials, and the codes comply with transparency and reproducibility standards in the field that they're working in, as well as the journal that they're submitting to. Increasingly, journals are requiring that data is deposited in an open repository and that authors make commitments to share their materials or any computer code that they used if requested by others. Corresponding authors are responsible for making sure that the data and the codes and materials are preserved, that they're saved, and they're retrievable for reanalysis if asked. They're responsible for confirming that the presentation of the materials is accurate and hasn't been manipulated in any way. They're responsible for signing off on all changes to galleys at the final publication stage. And they're responsible for, foreseeing in the future and minimizing obstacles to sharing data and code and materials. And they also need to act as timekeepers to make sure that revisions and requests from the editorial office are responded to quickly and within deadlines. So those are the responsibilities of corresponding authors. So if there have been participants in a study who have not contributed enough to warrant authorship, then those people can go in the acknowledgements section of a manuscript. So acknowledgements can go to people who have provided a level of technical assistance, but not enough to warrant authorship, have discussed ideas or given advice, but not enough to warrant authorship, advised on early drafts, or helped prepare materials or graphics or photos or things like that. Participants in studies are often noted in acknowledgements, and increasingly funding resources are required to be put in acknowledgements. That's an important point to bear in mind. You've got to look at the instructions to authors to see what each journal requires. We've talked about authorship as being in a gray area, that there is no one size fits all, that there are disciplinary differences and regional differences and differences amongst journals. But even within that context, authorship is also changing, because the scientific community writ large, the global scientific community, is increasingly demanding transparency in research, and authorship practices have been lagging behind a bit. There are trends in publishing, and in particular because research groups are becoming larger and larger and larger, it makes it more difficult for people to sort out who has done what. And the idea of authorship is changing because authorship groups are becoming larger and more international and more deeply collaborative. Conventions are also changing and varying among disciplines. CABI, agriculture and bioscience, is a great example of this, because of the very complicated research that people are doing to try and investigate everything from how to improve the food supply chain to how to create economically sustainable and environmentally sound practices in places that have resource constraints. These kinds of studies are incredibly important and also very in disciplinary practices among all the different kinds of people involved. And finally, also, electronic publication technologies and standards are changing, allowing the capturing of author contributions in persistent metadata. And this can make authorship more not just more transparent, but also more permanent. In particular, I am talking about ORCID IDs. If those of you listening to this webinar do not have an ORCID ID, I urge you to go to orchid.org and sign up for an ORCID ID. Oops, sorry about that. So ORCID IDs are persistent digital identifiers that each individual owns and controls that will distinguish you in a permanent way from every other researcher on the planet. So in the US, for example, there are zillions of different, maybe not zillions, but hundreds of thousands of different people named John Smith. If someone is an author with the name John Smith, they could so easily be confused with another John Smith. Similarly, in other languages, Chinese language, Arabic, others, there are people with the same names. And how do you get credit for work if you might be confused with a different researcher with the same name? So an ORCID ID gives you an individual ID number that's permanent, and those IDs are connected with your publications, your institutional affiliations, any grants or funding that you get, peer review work that you do, and it also allows that work to be shared with other systems. So these permanent researcher IDs allow you to get credit for all the work that you do. And over time, it will save you time and reduce confusion and the risk of errors between figuring out who is who. And these are digital identifiers, so they enable your ID and your work to be linked over time in a consistent and correct fashion. So ORCID IDs are the technology, one of the many technology solutions to authorship problems. Another change is a effort made by both publishing entities and professional societies to give very specific labels for roles in research activities. So earlier I showed you the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors and the Council of Science Editors and the NIH definitions of or parameters for authorship. This new effort by organizations to actually break it down into a standardized taxonomy of contributor roles will help to allow individual authors to be recognized for their specific contributions. And by doing that, it is hoped that it will reduce authorship disputes and facilitate collaboration. So this credit system allows authors to provide individual attribution and accurate attribution of each person to what they did and what their contribution was. And there's a list of the different credit taxonomies here on the left. Finally, I want to step back from the idea of the author as a writer and a contributor to individual pieces of research and talk about their broader role in society. Authors help when you are recognized as a strong, active researcher, a strong author. You can play a role in helping the public trust the science that you're publishing. And in the past, I used these images of well-known scientists, particularly in who are in the public eye often, Jane Goodall and E.O. Wilson and Rachel Carson. But now I'm sorry, but I put Anthony Fauci, who is the most prominent scientist in these days of pandemic. But authors like these play a role in society that help the public build trust in science, and that's incredibly important these days. Being a trusted author also puts you in a position to help distinguish between real and fake science. And that is also an important role for expert scientists to play in society these days. And established authors also help to advocate for science, to get funding when it is so needed in environmental protection and agriculture and things of that sort. So authors play really important roles in advocating for education and funding in scientific areas. So that's really it for today. I have here a list of resources related to what I discussed today, and these will be available on the CABI website, and I believe that you'll find them not only interesting, but really good resources to go back to throughout your career as a scientist and as a person who is publishing science, as baselines to help you make the complicated decisions related to authorship as you work on manuscripts and work on collaborations with your colleagues.
Before we close today's presentation, I want to encourage you to visit CABI.org for information, publications, and education related to agriculture and biosciences. Specifically, I hope that you will visit CABI Agriculture and Bioscience, CABI's open access multidisciplinary journal. The journal is published in collaboration with BMC, Springer Nature's open access branch, and is led by an editorial board of top-ranking researchers from around the world. The journal is compliant with best practices in publishing for high-impact journals and is committed to publishing rigorously conducted science. We accept both primary and cross-disciplinary studies and those with broad global impacts, as well as studies that reflect more narrow, specific, and local applications. We are committed to thorough, fast, and fair peer review, and again, we're open access with links on both the BMC and CABI websites. I also encourage you to visit AgriArchive, CABI's preprint server. This is a free open access resource for unpublished preprint materials across all the agriculture and biosciences. It's hosted and managed by CABI, and there's no fee for submitting. Materials are posted within 72 hours after a quick review for appropriateness of topic, but the materials are not peer-reviewed, edited, or typeset in any way before being posted online. You'll also find CABI's author education and services portal on the AgriArchive website. Thank you all for listening to this webinar, and if you have any questions or comments, please send them to me at p.benson@cabi.org. Thanks very much.